Some of you may remember that my wife and I were in Romania for 22 years. And Rod's not here, by the way, right? Oh, good. This is going to be fun. They have an expression that says, Când pisica nu e acasă. That means when the cat is not home, Scoarece se joacă pe masă. That means the mice play on the table. And Rod's not here, right? So you know where this is going, see? Well, there's something you might not know about Rod. See, he loves practical jokes. You might not have known that. He especially likes to be the brunt of them when you do them to him. So I was thinking, with the first Sunday back, you could do, he's not listening, by the way, is he, Rod? No. When he comes back, you could do random things, like in the middle of his sermon, raise a hand and ask a question about the end times, or as he gets up, just everyone move and sit in a different place. He would enjoy that. He would, he just likes that sort of thing. Now, I have another question for you. How many of you are old enough, you have to be honest, to remember Paul Harvey? All right, this is going to work. That's good. Okay. I don't know what it was about Paul Harvey. He was very folksy. He was a great storyteller. My dad loved Paul Harvey. They grew up together during the Depression, not, personally, but they both went through the Depression about the same age. It didn't matter what was happening in the house. At 12 o'clock noon, the radio came on. And my dad loved to listen to the rest of the story. And I remember that when I was a kid. It was always on, and we listened to the rest of the story. Our sons, Alex and Nate, are now 30 and 28. And it seems like it was just a few years ago they were learning how to drive. Okay, that's scary as a parent, isn't it, right? Especially when your boys tell you, oh, Dad, it's a piece of cake. I've been driving cars in online games for years. No, it's not the same. Okay. Pretty soon, they got their license. Pretty soon, they took the SAT. Pretty soon, they went off to college. And the rest of their story began. They're on their own. And our influence as parents, my influence as a father starts to diminish. And those of you who have adult children, you know exactly what that means. It's harder to parent an adult child. They make their own decisions. They go their own direction. They do their own thing. So as a parent, over time, our influence on our children begins to diminish. Does that, okay? This morning, I want to look at a specific generation of parents that also had a tremendous influence on their children. In fact, the decisions that those parents made in that generation had impacted the entire nation for generations and generations and generations to come. Those decisions that they forged was like a chain, and the first link that they made in that chain, unfortunately, was kind of weak. Because those parents of that generation made some bad decisions that seemed like minor ones, like small ones, but it affected their children, and the rest of their story did not always turn out well. I want you to turn in your Bibles to Joshua chapter 25. Did anybody find it? There actually is no Joshua 25. We're going to look at the whole book of Joshua and also the rest of the story in the book of Judges, okay? But I want to look at the broader context of Joshua, okay? Not only how it ended, but how it started. In fact, where everything started in Genesis, okay? We're not going to go all the way back to the creation. I know you guys got lunch in the oven, so we don't want to do that. But I want to look at the promise given to Abraham. We are going to come back to Joshua. In Genesis chapter 12, the Lord had said to Abraham, leave your country, your people, and your father's household, and go to the land I will show you. He then makes a promise to Abraham, a multifaceted promise. And he says, I will 5 times. And then he says, it will happen 2 more times. So 7 times God promises something to Abraham. In Genesis 12, he says, I will make you into a great nation. And I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all nations, that's us, by the way, included in that, and all nations on earth will be blessed through you. Pretty strong promise from God. And notice it's unconditional. God just says, I'm going to do this, period. This promise he made to Abraham. So what does Abraham do? He believes God, and he obeys. Genesis 12:4, it says, "So Abraham left as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abraham was 75 years old when he set out for Haran." Now, do you think you're too old to start something? He started something at 75. Moses was 80. I use that illustration teaching missionaries in Union Mills over near Asheville where we teach. And because sometimes we have second career missionaries that come through. They're in their 50s and 60s and sometimes mid-60s. And they're always thinking, I can't possibly learn the language. There's so little I can do. And I say, look, Moses did it at 80. Abraham did it at 75. So can you. So God can use us at any age. But Abraham believed him, and he did it. God made a promise. Abraham believed it. God gave him a command, and Abraham did it. Pretty simple rule of life. So Genesis chapter 12, verse 6, it says, Abram traveled through the land as far as the site of the great tree at Moreh at Shechem. Okay, so this is in the land of the Canaanites. At that time, the Canaanites were in the land. The Lord appeared to Abraham and said to him, "To your offspring, I will give this land." Wow, what a cool promise. But there was a problem. It was full of people, wasn't it? Okay. Now, Shechem was a pretty important place in the Old Testament and even in the New Testament. It's where Joseph's bones were buried by Joshua. It was between Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim, where the Israelites gathered to pronounce blessings and curses. Imagine millions of people going back and forth between these two mountains. This was a little town down in the valley in between. It later became the capital of Ephraim. It later became the capital of the 10 northern tribes. And it actually appears in the New Testament in a story we know very well, but we don't think about where it took place. Remember the woman at the well? The Samaritan woman? That was in Shechem. So he makes this promise to him at Shechem, in Shechem, and to whom he says, to all your descendants are going to benefit from this and get this land. And then he says in Genesis 15 to Abraham, after this, the word of the Lord came to Abraham in a vision. And God said to him, do not be afraid. Does that sound familiar? Does that come up in the book of Joshua? Remember in Joshua 1:9 it says to Joshua, God speaking, be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid. Same exact words. And you can see this parallelism, and you see this all through the Old Testament. The authors will make this small little comment that we normally don't catch, but that comment is full of meaning because it's referring back to a previous point in history or a previous place in history. God says to him in 15:5, he says, look up at the heavens and count the stars. And how many they didn't have light pollution back then, by the way. There weren't cities with lights. They could see a lot of them. And he says, if indeed you can count them, so shall your offspring be. Now, how old is Abraham? 75, no kids? Whoa, how's that going to happen? But it comes true. We find in Exodus chapter 12, it says, this is the people, the nation of Israel leaving Egypt. It says there were about 600,000 men on foot, besides women and children. And then it makes a comment, many other people, non-Israelites, went with them. Perhaps other slaves, perhaps Egyptians who were God-fearers. So you think about 600 men, not counting women and children. You figure most of those men are women. So 600,000. Say they have big families back then. They have 3 or 4 kids. You're talking at least 3 million people. Not quite as many as the stars, but that's a lot. And that was under being slaves in Egypt. And then God says to Abraham in 15:18, to your descendants I will give this land. So where did God promise Abraham the land? In Shechem, okay? To whom? To your descendants. And how many descendants? As many as the stars in the sky. Now, really turn to Joshua chapter 24. Okay, Joshua 24 actually exists, okay? Chapter 24 is the last chapter of the book of Joshua. Joshua is a book of remembering what God had done. Joshua reminding them of what they'd done, okay? Joshua chapter 24 is Joshua's farewell address, okay? It's towards the end of his life. He's not going to live much longer, and he wants to address the nation of Israel and help them remember something. And he reminds them of what God has done for them. 24:1 says, Then Joshua assembled all of the tribes of Israel at where? Why? Why did he do that? What's the point he's trying to make? He's telling them, look, this is where God promised the land, and now you're in it. He's showing them the fulfillment of God's promise to Abraham had come true. They're there. They had taken the land. In verses 2 through 4 of chapter 24, he recounts to them that promise that was given to Abraham. 5 through 7, he recounts the Exodus. And he makes a comment. He says, you saw with your own eyes. Now, that was about 50, maybe 55 years previous. So some of the older people remembered the parting of the Red Sea. But believe me, they had heard that story. They heard that story from the parents. How could you not tell your kids, hey, you wouldn't believe what happened when I was your age. I crossed the Red Sea. God parted it on dry land. He reminds them in verses 8 through 10, the defeat of the Amorites on the East Jordan. He reminds them how they had crossed the Jordan. All of them had, except the smallest of children. Anyone over about 15 or 20 had crossed the Jordan River. Because the entire book of Joshua only happens in about 15 years, maybe 20 at the most. And that symbolism of crossing the Jericho was the same symbolism of Moses crossing the Red Sea. So God shows these parallelisms between Joshua and Moses, and in different places, in the same place, in the words, all of that to tie the two stories together. A story that had not happened really that long ago, Moses crossing the Red Sea and the wandering. So he's reminding them of God's faithfulness. This is Joshua in his farewell address to the nation of Israel. God's faithfulness not only to Abraham, not only for the past 600 years, but to them specifically. In that very generation that Joshua was talking to in Joshua 24, his farewell address, is the first generation to be recipients of that promise made to Abraham all those years before. They were the first to see, to walk on, to touch with their hands the promised land, to drink the milk and taste the honey, to live in houses they had not built and enjoy grapes they had not planted. That was the broader scope of the promise that led to the book of Joshua. Okay, now I want to go back in time again, okay? Go back in time again, about 15 or 20 years ago, to another farewell address, okay? Not Joshua's farewell address, but Moses' address. And again, many of these people had heard that address. And that is the book of Deuteronomy. And towards the end of the book of Deuteronomy, if you look in Deuteronomy chapter 32 now, if you go back, so we're going back in time about 20 years or so, because the book of Joshua is only about that long. And what is Moses doing here? Just like Joshua is going to do 20 years later, Moses is reminding the people of what? God's faithfulness, God's promise. And he does that by listing and mentioning all the things that they had gone through, how they had seen the manna. They had eaten it every day. They had seen the pillar of fire and the pillar of smoke. All those miracles that they had seen, he reminds them of the promise and the faithfulness of God. Think of that generation under Moses, all that they had experienced. And for several days, the book of Deuteronomy was read to them. Okay? So in Deuteronomy chapter 32, verse 45, Moses finished reciting all of these words to Israel. That was one long sermon, by the way. He said to them, "Take heart, all of the words I have solemnly declared to you this day." What? So that you may command your children to obey. What is he telling them to do? Okay, you experienced all this. You saw God's miracles. You experienced God's faithfulness. Your children have not yet. Share with them God's word. Share with them the stories of God's faithfulness. And that was a key point that Moses was making in his farewell address to the people. And then the very next day, after Moses had finished his long sermon, okay, they watched him walk off alone to climb Mount Nebo and die. He had led his people for 40 years. He had obeyed God. He had stood up to Pharaoh. Remember the 10 plagues? There's even a movie about it, by the way, the 10 Commandments. You've seen that, Charlton Heston. Think of all the things that Moses had done in his life, the things that he had experienced, and yet at the very end of his life, he's not allowed to enter the promised land. Moses? I mean, talk about a great man, and yet he can't. Chapter 32 of Deuteronomy, 50 to 52, it says, "There on the mountain that you have climbed, you will die." This is God speaking to him. Why? "Because you did not uphold my holiness among the Israelites. Therefore, you will only see the land from a distance." And that's what he saw from Moab. It's a high plateau looking over the promised land. Moses was able to see the promise, but not experience himself. Because of what? One small, minor, little decision he made when he struck the rock in anger in Numbers chapter 20. He wasn't supposed to strike it, he was supposed to speak to it. So for that one disobedience of God, that one little decision, that one little act, he had to pay the consequences 40 years later and not enter the promised land. Now, the generation that was standing there all heard of Moses' sin. Many of them probably saw it when they were children. And they had witnessed it. And now an entire generation was assembled together, and they're watching the consequences of that one act of Moses 40 years later. Imagine that scene. Millions of people at the base of a mountain watching an old man walk up a mountain and knowing he's never going to return. Just picture that in your mind for a minute. They not only saw the sin and the consequences of Moses' sin, that generation in Moses' farewell speech had experienced the consequences of their parents' sin. And what did their parents do? Remember, they sent out spies, and 10 of the spies were like, "Oh, there's giants in the land, we can't possibly do this." And Joshua and Caleb tried to convince them, "No, God is on our side." And what did the people believe? The 10, not the 2. And the people refused to enter the land. Now, what were they doing? They weren't trusting God. It seems like a small decision. They didn't enter the land, but they had to pay for it. And so they had to wander in the desert for 40 years. Why? So that every adult from that generation would die and not enter the land. Now, imagine you being a child in the desert wandering, watching and waiting for your parents to die, your aunts to die, your uncles to die, the friends of your parents to die. Now, there were about 3 or 4 million people leaving, and I did some math. They wandered for 40 years, and if about 2 million people were dying or so, in 14,000 days, that would be about 150 people dying every single day. And remember, they're wandering. They didn't have time for funerals. It was pretty quick. They just buried you and moved on. And as a child, you're wandering through the desert, watching and looking at these piles of rocks, 100 every day, of people. Now, this is kind of weird. What would it have been like to be the last parent? Everybody's standing around waiting, like, come on, if you die, we can go, But just imagine the impact of that experience on those kids watching the consequences of what seemed like a small decision, not entering the land. It's not something you would forget easily, and I think it was pretty sobering for them. Why did they have to die? That one little decision of not entering the land. Are you starting to see the importance of little decisions and the impact they have on the next generation? Moses striking the rock, their parents not trusting God. Think, too, of all the miracles they witnessed. Not only the generation of Moses, but the generation of Joshua. As children in the wilderness, they had tasted and eaten manna every day. Perhaps they were too young to remember crossing the Red Sea, because that was like 50, 60 years ago now. But they did cross the Jordan River just about 15 or 20 years ago. And they didn't even get their feet wet. I mean, that's pretty cool. They saw the fall of Jericho. Remember how Jericho fell? What? Blowing trumpets and the walls come down? Talk about a miracle. They saw the taking of the city of Ai and many other cities. And something cool in Joshua chapter 10 they experienced. They watched the sun stand still. How that happened, I don't understand it, but God can do it. But they saw that with their own eyes. They saw God's power crossing the Jordan, the sun standing still, Jericho falling down. They saw God's faithfulness. In chapter 21, verses 43 through 45, Joshua, it says, "So the Lord God gave Israel all the land he had sworn to their fathers, and they took possession of it and settled there. The Lord gave them rest on every side, just as he had sworn to their forefathers. Not one of their enemies withstood them. The Lord handed all their enemies over to them. Not one of the Lord's good promise to the house of Israel failed. Everyone was fulfilled." Wow, to be that generation in the book of Joshua. He goes on in 24:13, God's provision. "I gave you a land on which you did not toil, and cities you did not build. And you live in them and eat from the vineyards and olive groves that you did not even plant." Wow, did God provide for them. God's power, God's faithfulness, God's provision, they experienced and saw all of that. And they had been living it for the past 15 or 20 years over the course of the book of the Joshua. The generation of the book of Joshua was the recipient of a great promise. And Joshua, in his farewell address to them, reminded them of that. They had not only been reminded of God's faithfulness, they had experienced God's faithfulness. They had not only been reminded of miracles, they had experienced God's miracles, and they had seen God's promise fulfilled. And now, just to make sure they get the message, Joshua at least 10 times challenges them to obey in his farewell sermon. Joshua 22, verse 5. "But be very careful to keep the commandment and the law that Moses, the servant of the Lord, gave you." What? "To love the Lord your God, to walk in his ways, to obey his commands, and to hold fast to him, and to serve him with all your heart and all your soul." 22:5. In verse 23, 6 and 8, he says to them, he again challenges them to obey. "Be very strong, be careful to obey all that is written in the book of the law. Hold fast to the Lord your God as you have until now." Then he gives them a warning in 23:12. "But if you turn away," what's going to happen? "Then you may be sure that the Lord your God will no longer drive out these nations before you. Instead, those nations, the Canaanites and them, they will become snares and traps for you, and whips on your back and thorns in your eyes, until you perish from this good land which the Lord your God has given you." A challenge and a warning. He warns them again, verses 14 through 16. "If you," goes on, "go and serve other gods and bow down to them, then what's going to happen? The Lord's anger will burn against you, and you will quickly perish from the good land he has given you." Pretty strong warning, isn't it? 24:14, Joshua says, "Now fear the Lord and serve him with all faithfulness." And then the famous verse in 24:15, Joshua says, "Choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve." So he's challenging them. They had been reminded of God's faithfulness. They had experienced God's faithfulness. They had heard of God's miracles. They had experienced God's miracles. They had been challenged to obey. And they even made repeated commitments to obey. The book of Joshua starts out from the very beginning. They say, 1:16, "Whatever you have commanded us, we will do." This is the people, the generation of Joshua. "And wherever you send us, we will go. Just as we fully obeyed Moses, so will we obey you." That's the beginning of the book of Joshua. Jump to the end of the book of Joshua. Their commitment to obey, 24:16. "Far be it from us to forsake the Lord and serve other gods." Boy, I bet that was going to come back to haunt them when they're reminded they had said that. 24:21, it says, "We will serve the Lord." 24:24, the people say, "We will serve the Lord and God and obey him." Pretty strong commitment, isn't it? They had been reminded of God's faithfulness. They had experienced God's faithfulness. They had heard of God's miracles. They had seen God's miracles. They had experienced his promises. They had been challenged to obey, and they made commitments to obey. They had seen the results of disobedience with Moses. They had seen and experienced the result of sin with their parents. Now, with all of that, you would think they would obey God with all their heart and soul. Well, they did, sorta, kinda, half-heartedly. When we read through the book of Joshua, we notice the successes, because those are emphasized, the defeat of the Canaanites. But the author of the book of Joshua is very subtle because he includes a number of little comments throughout the book that are easy to skip over. And I want to look at those. Joshua chapter 9. Remember the Gibeonites? It was people that lived in the land, but they put on old clothes, covered themselves with dirt and dust like they'd been traveling for a long time, and they deceived the Israelites into thinking they were a nation far away and asked for a treaty. Now there's this little comment in Joshua 9, the people did not inquire of the Lord. Oops, got off to a little bad start there. Joshua chapter 13 through 19, there's a lot of success, but there's little comments that the author includes in 13:13. But the Israelites did not drive out the people of Geshur and Makkah, so they continue to live among the Israelites to this day. Now, what were the Israelites supposed to do? They were supposed to drive out all of the people of Canaan. But did they? Not quite. 1563. Judah, very strong tribe, could not dislodge the Jebusites living in where? Jerusalem. Wait. If there's any city you're supposed to take that one. And this is the strongest tribe, Judah. And it says they could not. Now, they could because God could, but I think they would not. They didn't try. 1610, it says they did not dislodge the Canaanites living in Gezer. In 1712, Manasseh, another tribe, was not able to occupy those towns, for the Canaanites were determined to live there. Now, God was on their side. God can part the Red Sea. God can drive out the Canaanites. It wasn't God's failure. It was that generation's failure. Half-heartedly obeying. 1947, the Danites, another tribe, had difficulty taking possession of their territory. Well, they shouldn't have to have any difficulty because God's on their side. But what was happening? They didn't fully believe God's promise. They didn't fully trust Him. They didn't fully obey. That's the story of the book of Joshua. A lot of successes, but there's these little decisions they made where they didn't take this town or fully drive out the people. Now, you look at that, and they did drive out most of the Canaanites. They did take most of the land, and they did obey God most of the time. So that's not bad. I mean, they probably should get at least a B, right? Maybe a B plus, okay? But you're getting the hint here of what is going to happen next. Joshua 24:31, towards the end of the book. Israel served the Lord throughout the lifetime of Joshua and of the elders who outlived him and who had experienced everything the Lord had done for Israel. Notice what it doesn't say. It doesn't say they obeyed him after that. And they didn't. They kind of kept their act together while Joshua was alive and the elders were alive. So now, with Paul Harvey, I want to look at the rest of the story. Okay? Joshua 25, actually, the book of Judges. Judges starts out pretty good. If you look in Judges chapter 1, verse 1, it says, the Israelites seek the Lord for guidance. That's what they're supposed to do. They go on in verse 4 of chapter 1, they attack the Canaanites and Perizzites. The Lord gives 10,000 of them into their hands. And finally, in 1:8, they attack Jerusalem, and they take it. Finally. They were supposed to do that a long time ago. Judges 1:9, they take the hill country, the Negev, the western foothills, Hebron, Debir, Zephtha, Gaza, Ashkelon, Ekron. So they start out pretty good in Judges chapter 1. They're doing exactly what they're supposed to do. They seek God's will to drive the Canaanites out. But look in chapter 1, verse 19. Things are going downhill, aren't they? Judges 1:19. Judah took possession of the hill country, but they were unable. What? What do you mean they're unable? Of course they're able. God was able. They were unable to drive the people from the plains because they had chariots fitted with iron. So what? If God can part the Red Sea, he can take care of chariots with iron. So what was going on? God was able, but the people were unwilling. And so they had this incomplete obedience, which is another word for disobedience. In chapter 2, God steps in, sends the angel of the Lord, and God's judgment on them for their incomplete obedience. Judges chapter 2, verse 2 says, "Yet you have disobeyed me. Why have you done this?" 2, 6, and 7, it says that generation followed the Lord for what? 1 generation. And just 1 generation later, this is the book of Judges, the generation of the book of Judges now, they forsook the Lord. And this is a sad verse. Look in Judges 2:10. After that whole generation had been gathered to their ancestors, the generation of the book of Joshua, another generation grew up. This is the generation of the book of Judges, their children. Another generation grew up who knew what? Neither the Lord nor what he had done for Israel. How could they forget so quickly? Because their parents, the previous generation, didn't teach them and remind them and tell them the stories of God's faithfulness. Judges chapter 2, 16 through 19, we see this cycle of sin and deliverance. Verse 16 of 2, the Lord raised up judges, yet they would not listen to their judges, but prostituted themselves to other gods and worshiped them. Verse 18, whenever the Lord raised up a judge for them, he would save them out of the hands of their enemies as long as the judge lived. Verse 19, but when the judge died, the people returned to ways even more corrupt than those of their ancestors, following other gods and serving and worshiping them. Chapter 2, verse 20, therefore the Lord was very angry with Israel. That's not a good place to be. When God's mad at you, it doesn't go too well. By chapter 3, verse 5 and 6, it says, the Israelites lived among the Canaanites, the people they were supposed to drive out. Why were they supposed to drive them out? Because they would be a snare to them, a trap to them. They took their daughters in marriage and gave their own daughters to their sons and did what? The people of Israel served their gods, the gods of the Canaanites, who were disgusting, by the way. And this is just the beginning of the rest of the story. It actually gets worse. The book of Judges has a series of cycles of 12 times where the people cry out to God. He sends them a judge to deliver them from the oppressor. They follow God for a short time while that judge is alive, although not every time did they even do that. But as soon as that judge is gone, they become even worse than they were the generation before. There's a sad story towards the end of the book of Judges in chapter 17. It's about a guy named Micah. He steals, it's really a weird story. He steals 1,100 shekels of silver from his own mother. Okay, it's pretty bad. It's a lot of money, by the way. And then there's this weird comment about his mother blessing him about stealing it. It's just kind of odd, and it's startling. It makes you, what's going on in this story? His mother gives the money back to his own son, who had stolen it from her, and says to him, take it to the silversmith and make an idol out of it. Can you see how depraved the society is becoming? So then Micah, instead of having trained his next generation, his son, to follow God, what does he do? He installs his son to be a pagan priest. Wow. Next generation. A Levite is traveling through. Now, who were the Levites? The Levites were supposed to be the priests, right? This guy obviously was not. Micah hires him to be his private priest, a pagan priest, for 10 shekels a year in salary. A Levite, who were supposed to be the true priests. And this guy agrees to it. And then the story gets even stranger. In chapter 18, the Danites, this is an entire tribe, were traveling through. They heard or they saw that Micah had this priest. So they steal the priest. They talk him into being their priest, and they steal the idols away from Micah, who actually belonged to Micah's mom, who he stole them from. And then the mom blesses him for stealing them. It's just this convoluted story of sin. 17:6, it says, in those days, everyone did as they saw fit. They sure did, didn't they? So the Danites, they steal Micah and his priest, the Levite, and his idols, and they set up a pagan temple in Dan, which later becomes the capital of the tribe, and they install someone to be the priest of that pagan temple. Chapter 18. Anyone ever notice who that person was? The grandson of Moses. Let that sink in. The grandson of Moses is now the head pagan priest in the city of Dan. Talk about breaking the chain. I think the grossest chapter in the Bible is chapter 19 of Judges. This story is so disgusting. I hate even to tell the story. So there's a Levite. He's traveling with his concubine. He's on his way back. They stop in Gibeah in Benjamin. Okay? And it mentions they didn't want to stop in Jabus, okay, because that's Jerusalem. Why? Because it's full of pagans and bad people. So, and then he enters into the city in Benjamin, and no one takes him in. That's another hint, because in their culture, you're supposed to take care of strangers and travelers. Nobody takes him in until finally an old man takes him into his home. And then it says, while they were enjoying themselves in the old man's home, some of the wicked men of the city surrounded the house, pounding on the door. They shouted to the old man who owned the house, bring out the man who came to your house so that we can have sex with him. Does that sound familiar? When did that happen before? Sodom and Gomorrah. It's the parallel. The people had become so wicked, they were no better than the people of Sodom and Gomorrah. Now, odd comment. The host suggested them, well, why don't you rape my daughter instead? What? Instead, they sent out the man's concubine. All night, she's raped and abused. The next morning, the Levite priest, supposed to be better than this, and his only response to her is, get up, let's go. This is a horrible story. And then it says the Levite cuts her into 12 pieces and ships them off to the different tribes to come attack Benjamin. And the author, when you're reading this story, look for what's missing. Now, I think she was dead, but the author doesn't even mention she's dead. He just says, get up. She doesn't respond, so he cuts her up. But that's the kind of depravity that the people had fallen into in those days. In those days, Israel had no king, and everyone did as he saw fit. The last verse of the book of Judges. What is the rest of the story of the book of Joshua? The book of Judges. And you could go on with more examples in Israel's future, how they disobeyed God. But where did it all go wrong? All of the book of Judges, in fact, the rest of the Old Testament, the result of the sin of one generation, the generation of the book of Joshua, because of their incomplete obedience. But especially because they did not transfer their love of God, their faithfulness to God, the stories of God, their obedience to God. They did not transfer that to the next generation. And Christianity is like a chain. Each link has to be forged by the previous generation. And a chain is only as strong as its weakest link. And if you don't forge that link for the next generation, Christianity stops. We've seen that in Europe. Christianity more or less has died. Each of us has to be a blacksmith that helps forge the chain for the next generation. You must help forge that link in the next generation for Christianity to continue. And if we don't, the consequences are grave. I can't think of a sadder verse in the Bible, Judges chapter 2, verse 10. After that whole generation, the generation of Joshua 10:24, the book of Joshua, that had heard Joshua's farewell address, after that whole generation had been gathered to their fathers, another generation grew up who knew neither the Lord nor what he had done for Israel. They had been reminded of God's faithfulness. They'd experienced God's faithfulness. They had heard of God's miracles. They had seen God's miracles. They had been challenged to obey. They had made commitments to obey. They had seen the results of sin. But did they forge the next link in the chain? No, they failed. They broke the chain, and the very next generation grew up not knowing the Lord and what he had done for them. Be careful to forge the chain. The rest of the story depends on us. And as Paul Harvey would say, and now you know the rest of the story. Good day.